Right, we're going to start a new topic, which is the League of Nations and the United Nations, which comes up quite often on exam papers. In fact, when I did an analysis of exam papers to work this course out of the 8 papers that I looked at, it came up 5 times in the general section. Now, admittedly, one of those was half a question, and there was another half on something else, so you could say 4.5 times out of 8, but it's still an area very well worth learning, because, you know, it's the chance of it coming up quite high. So I've broken it down into 3 bits, which is 1 unit on the League of Nations, 1 on the United Nations, and 1 comparing. I think that's what the 3rd unit is. And then, so today we're going to look at the earlier of the 2 international bodies, which is the League of Nations. I'm going to look at its origins, where it came from, a bit of which you already know from having looked at Woodrow Wilson and the end of the First World War. Its structure, how it was organised, what its main bodies were, its weaknesses, the things which were a problem with it, and then some specific examples of how it could not do what it set out to do, which was basically to stop aggression in the world. Okay? So, start off with origins, where it came from. Right. At the end of the First World War, the idea of having a League of Nations, an international body to which all countries could belong and where they could go if they had disputes they wanted to settle, was championed. The idea was championed by Woodrow Wilson. Now, who can remember who Woodrow Wilson was? Were you around when we did Woodrow Wilson? Might have been. I don't know. James should know.
He's an American president.
Yeah.
During the First World War.
Yes. Yeah, that's it. He was the president of the USA. Can you remember whether he was a Democrat or a Republican? Go on, it's got to be one or the other. Plump for one.
Democrat?
Yes, he was. He was a Democrat. Very good, Alex. And Woodrow Wilson wanted to have this organisation to prevent another world war occurring. And his idea was that nations should settle their disputes peacefully without going to war. And in order to further this idea, he managed to get the mechanism for setting up the League of Nations written into all the peace treaties that were made at the Paris Peace Conference. So the various treaties that were made had in them provision for setting up this international organisation. He was insistent that in the peace talks, the League of Nations idea should be very high up the list of things that was discussed, and all the victorious powers, all the powers on the winning side at the end of the First World War, agreed the covenant of the League of Nations, which was its foundation document. We'll talk about that later. However, although the victors, the winners, the winning side of the First World War, all agreed in principle that there would be a League of Nations, the different leaders and the different countries had different ideas of what this organisation would be like, how it would run, and what it would do. Basically, we can divide the 2 sorts of ideas into 2 groups. Some people wanted an organisation with quite a narrow remit, and its idea was that it would deal with international crises as they came up. If a problem arose in an area, then when that problem appeared, the League of Nations would be there as a way of helping to deal with it. And the idea was that the League of Nations would help to delay actual warfare happening until some kind of settlement was reached, and therefore war wouldn't happen. So that would be its remit. It would be a narrow focus of being there so that 2 nations who were in dispute with one another could apply to the League of Nations, a settlement would be worked out and war would be avoided. One of the people who was keen to have a narrow remit for the League of Nations was David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of what country? We've met with him before.
Great Britain.
Great Britain, yes. He was a narrow league enthusiast, but he was prepared to go along with the other idea, which was for a broader league, which I'll explain to you later on. And in fact, it's interesting that Lloyd George worked out many of the details for the League of Nations, even though Woodrow Wilson actually got credit for the idea. So that's the narrow league team, as it were. Other people wanted a broad league, a League of Nations that would start straight away working at root ideas and problems which were the causes of war. For instance, to sort out what was to happen with colonies, that is, nations, specifically in parts of the world such as Africa, which were ruled by other countries. To deal with colonies, to deal with social problems and labour problems, and also to encourage international disarmament in general. That is, to encourage countries to limit the amount of arms and armed forces they had and to mutually disarm. So that was a broad League of Nations, not just something that was there and in the event of a war situation blowing up to start to act, but that would be what I suppose we would call these days proactive, to start beforehand, to get in there before trouble. And an example of somebody whose idea was a very broad League of Nations was the South African Prime Minister, whose name was Jan Smuts. He published a document called The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion in 1918. Woodrow Wilson himself also was a broad league man. Okay? Now, I'm not going to spend a long time today talking about the actual structure of the League of Nations, because the only person who's really got to learn all this is James, and it's very clearly set out in a chart in the Watson book. There's a page 32, there's a comparative chart with a diagram, and it's got the League of Nations and the United Nations. It shows you all the names of the different bodies and offices and what functions they did in both organisations. And really, the best way to learn that is to look at the chart. So I'm just going to point out a couple of things which are important because they affected what happened to the League of Nations and how it functioned in history. One of these is the principle of one nation, one vote. You know that in a democratic country such as ours, one person has one vote, and that's one of the principles of the kind of democracy that we live in. That was extended to the League of Nations in the following way. Each nation who was a member of the League of Nations had one vote in league affairs. Now, there are problems with that idea, which I think, if you think about what nations are like compared to people, each person is, as it were, an equivalent individual in a democratic society. The problem in the world is that some nations are bigger than others, physically in terms of numbers of people. And some nations also perceive themselves, rightly or wrongly, as more important. But all these things were not taken into account. It was just rough and ready, one nation, one vote. So, among the first members of the League of Nations, with a vote equal to that of Britain or France or America, America wasn't actually in the League in the end, but as it was proposed were Australia, which has a relatively small population, Canada, Brazil, little nations like Uruguay, Liberia, Siam, all with one vote, however many people lived there or wherever they were in the world. The other thing which is worth particularly singling out when talking about the League of Nations structure is something called mandates. The League of Nations took a practical step in the government of colonies by Western powers. Under the League of Nations, each colony was considered to be governed by whoever was governing it by mandate from the League of Nations. Mandate was like a sacred trust. In other words, the governors were holding the government of these colonies in trust for the people who lived there, and with a view eventually to them having some sort of independence perhaps, and recognising that those who governed, basically they were Europeans, often British but sometimes Portuguese, French and so on, that these ruling nations had obligations to the people that they ruled. Now that wasn't something that was always automatically recognised. I mean, to us it seems obvious, doesn't it? If you are the ruling country and you're ruling another country, you have deep obligations to those people who you're ruling. So the League of Nations was a focus for this idea of mandates, the countries being mandated to rule in the interests of the people that they ruled. So that's all I'm going to say about the structure. As I say, you, James, will have to go away and look at that chart to make sure that you understand and know it. So we'll move on then to looking at things about the League of Nations which were weaknesses, and that we can see with hindsight especially made it difficult for it to function in the way that those who set it up had hoped. Firstly, I'll tell you some of the things that people accused it of. The most common negative accusation was that the League of Nations was a European club, an organisation for Westerners and Americans, but they weren't in it, but white people basically, to be in charge. In fact, that wasn't the case. With the one nation, one vote, non-Europeans actually were in a majority, but nevertheless it was perceived as having been set up by Westerners on Western lines for their benefit. Okay, so that was a big accusation. Secondly, all the decisions had to be unanimous, which means what? What's unanimous? Alex, unanimous?
What time is it?
Can you give me about 15, 20 minutes? 15? I'll give you a shout. Unanimous.
No.
Anyone else?
It's where either everybody or almost everybody, votes the same way.
Yeah, well, in the League of Nations it was everybody. In order, if a proposal was put to the League and it was put to a vote, it could not be carried out unless every single nation agreed to it. Now, in practice, that constantly prevented the League of Nations from doing anything at all. So that was another weakness. A third weakness was that the machinery that was set up, the systems that were put in place, made an assumption about where war would come from. It assumed that the problems would come from lesser powers, small nations. And really, it couldn't solve the problem of how war could be prevented if a major power wanted to fight. After the Paris peace settlement, countries that didn't like the treaties that had come out of that complained and had their treaties amended, altered. Now, although the changes were very small, the principle, and we'll see this as we go on, the principle became established that if you made a fuss, and especially if you threatened or even used force, you got what you wanted. And this undermined the League of Nations and its whole principle, since it did not and could not prevent this. So there were the treaties at the end of the First World War. Some nations were dissatisfied with what they were getting out of those treaties, and they threatened or even used force, whereupon the treaties were amended. And the League of Nations in no instance was able to stop that happening, and so it began to be seen as a rather toothless organisation. Now, I've told you that it was included in all the peace treaties signed at the end of the First World War, all of them. And this made it very hard for the defeated powers to be enthusiastic about it, because they tended to look at it as something that had been cooked up for their punishment, not for their help. Those treaties for them were not a positive thing. They were treaties imposed upon them because they had to surrender. So something that was part of them was not something that they looked at with much enthusiasm. So that was another weakness. The last weakness was that the USA, even though its president had dreamed up the idea of being enthusiastic about it, did not join the League of Nations. And it was the richest and most powerful economy in the world, and it wasn't a member. So that made the League of Nations rather sort of... there was a big gap in it, because this strong and powerful industrialised nation was not a member. And it also made the League less transcontinental than it might have been. Now, I'm not going to go today into the details of why the USA wasn't a member, because we went through all those when we looked at Woodrow's presidency, when we looked at the USA itself. Another thing to notice was, we've already said that the League was built on democratic principles, one nation, one vote. Now, this period in between the wars was not a period when democracy was fashionable in a lot of places. Can you think of places where democracy was definitely out of fashion? Who turned their noses up at democracy and said that it was a waste of time? We've come to James for an answer again.
Germany, Italy, Russia.
Yes, yeah.
A lot of Eastern Europe as well.
Yes. What did Mussolini think of democracy? Rubbish, he thought it was. Do you remember what he said? The 20th century is the century of fascism. Yeah, which is not democracy. What about Stalin? What was his view of democracy? Democracy was for wimps, yeah? Wasn't it? And the same with Hitler. So, in a period when these three factors were very powerful, a democratic organisation like the League of Nations was looked upon as a weak, weedy, wimpish kind of thing. Which great big democracy wasn't even in it? The USA. So a big, successful democracy was not in it. All these non-democratic nations were in it. Lots of anti-democratic ideas washing around. Democracy failed in a lot of places in this era. In Russia, where it lasted just 1 year, if you count from the end of Tsarism, the establishment of a proper Duma, until the end of that, it's only about a year. Hungary, Poland, Austria, Italy, Spain, Yugoslavia, Germany, all those countries did away with democracy in that period. It was not a time when democracies were flourishing. All this disheartened supporters of democracy, destroyed what remained of confidence in the Paris Peace Conference, the 1919 settlement, and also very much weakened the League of Nations, which was seen as holding up a flag for democracy, which was not perceived as a successful and good system in that period. Right? So that's the general why it didn't succeed, or its weaknesses. Now here are some examples of places in the world in that period between the First and Second World War where the League of Nations absolutely failed to stop wars and aggression, or even to get a just settlement for people who were the victims of aggression. First of all, fairly early on, 1932, the area of China which is called Manchuria was overrun by the Japanese. If any of you know anything about the story of Gladys Aylward the missionary, it's worth reading in connection with this as incidental material. she was in China during this period as a missionary, and the Sino-Japanese War, the war between China and Japan, as a central feature of her life in China at that time. So Manchuria was... Hello? Manchuria was overrun by the Japanese, and China appealed to the League of Nations, which was what they were supposed to do. The League of Nations response was very slow, not good if you're being overrun by a powerful enemy. A commission was set up under Lord Lytton, which condemned the Japanese aggression and declared that Manchuria was Chinese, although it allowed that Japan had special interests in Manchuria, and recommended Manchuria to have a high degree of self-government, so the Chinese were to step back and let the Manchurians govern themselves, and the Japanese were told to withdraw. Right? So that was what the League of Nations said. What happened? Did this happen? No. All that happened was Japan left the League of Nations in 1933 and extended its conquests in China. Okay, just shut the door. Good boy. The League of Nations was absolutely powerless because it didn't have any military sanctions that it could apply, and countries who didn't like what the League told them to do could just leave. So what? We're not in it then. If you tell us to do something we don't like, hello. Right, so that was Manchuria. Now, we've already talked about Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia. The Italian dictator Mussolini had been looking at Manchuria, Abyssinia, as a handy place. It's in Africa, for a number of reasons. Way back in the previous century, Abyssinia had defeated Italy. Mussolini, if you remember where Italy is, like a boot sticking down into the Mediterranean, he wanted a Roman Empire, including Italy and the areas around the Mediterranean, and that part of Africa there, which bordered on Italian Somaliland, was just right for him. He had his eye on it. There was a dispute in 1934 over a border oasis between Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia. There was a bit of a battle, a bit of a skirmish, and Mussolini demanded compensation from Ethiopia, and he also wanted the oasis. The Ethiopian emperor, whose name was Haile Selassie, appealed to the League of Nations. The League of Nations' response was to recommend that Italy and Ethiopia negotiated. So, what did Mussolini do? Did he negotiate? No. He gathered lots of troops. He took them through the British-controlled Suez Canal and attacked Ethiopia with 250,000 soldiers. So again, you see, there's no reason why he should do what the League of Nations tells him. This time, the League of Nations response was much quicker. The Council and the Assembly declared Italy was the aggressor and suggested sanctions against Italy. Anybody know what sanctions are? Sanctions done?
Does it keep them in their own area?
Not quite. It's to do with trade. James?
It's kind of quite define it. It's basically telling a nation that putting restrictions on certain things, and it's kind of quite forceful.
Yeah, it basically means we will not sell to you or buy from you. Right, so it's like sending you to Coventry, if you like, in an economic way. So a nation finds that it can't get the things it needs, nor can it sell what it needs to sell in order to gain foreign exchange. So sanctions on Italy to force them to stop the attack on Ethiopia. But there were certain items not to be included in these sanctions, and they were coal, oil and steel. Right? So that immediately means that the sanctions have very little effect, except on the poor people at home if they need food supplies from abroad. To add to this, Austria, Germany and Hungary refused to apply any sanctions at all, and the British kept the Suez Canal open to Italian supplies. So that wasn't going to really do a great deal, basically, because Mussolini could still get what he needed to fight, coal, oil, steel. Then another plan was put together, the Hall-Laval plan, by which Italy was to be given 2/3 of Ethiopia, and in exchange, Ethiopia was to get a strip of British Somaliland, which would give them access to the sea. It's not exactly a good deal for Ethiopia. So the Ethiopians rejected that. They didn't want to lose 2/3 of their country in order to get a little bit of the sea. And the Italians rejected it too, because they knew that if they pushed on with their conquest, they would have all of Ethiopia, thank you very much. So all parties rejected that, and the sanctions were tightened, but they still didn't apply them to oil, which is the basic need for an army in the field. In 1936, the conquest of Ethiopia continued. Addis Ababa, which is the capital, was taken. The emperor, Haile Selassie, was exiled, and that was the end of Ethiopia. It was interestingly a 2,000-year-old empire, and that was the end of it. So, the League of Nations had failed, sanctions were useless, and force had succeeded. Now, you think about how that fits in for the moment with the thinking in that period. What did Mussolini say? I adore war. Yeah? In other words, if you fight for things, that is right. And the strongest person has the right to win. Does anybody know where that idea, which seems to us abhorrent, the idea that might is right, where did it come from in the thinking of people in this period? Does anybody know? But it comes from a very interesting idea. Yes, James. How could it be an evolutionary idea?
Survival of the fittest.
Yes, survival of the fittest. In other words, if you believe that the human race improves by the strongest and the fittest surviving, then obviously the morally right thing to do is to fight, because battle is a fair evolutionary way of seeing who ought to win, because the weakest side is going to lose, and the strongest side, which is going to be the side with the most brains, the most strength, best for the human race, is going to be the side that wins. So you can see that evolution, in this period, evolution justifies the whole outlook of somebody like Mussolini. Right? That's just an aside, but I think it's quite interesting. Other areas where the League of Nations totally failed was Poland. The Poles wanted to enlarge their borders, so they seized the capital of Lithuania, Vilna, which was right in their sights. If you have a map, you'd see. They did that in 1920, right after the Versailles settlement, really. They occupied Vilna. Lithuanians claimed vigorously that it was theirs, but the League of Nations took very little notice, and Vilna was incorporated into Poland in 1922. This situation was approved by the Conference of Ambassadors. Now, we talk about the Conference of Ambassadors. If you remember, we were talking about Mussolini and the Corfu incident. It was the Conference of Ambassadors that Mussolini's generals were working for when they were shot, and the Corfu incident blew up. It was a non-League of Nations body. It was there to regulate the Versailles Treaty, the Paris Peace Conference treaties. I'll talk to you later on, okay?
What?
Talk to you later on when we finish.
Can I go outside?
Put your jumper on and don't fall over.
I won't.
Okay, we're nearly there. Right, there was another similar thing with Poland and Russia, the Curzon line, the Russian border. Again, I won't go into details, but basically force gained the objective. The Poles got the border moved 100 miles east into Russia, and force was the winning thing in that. Also in Yugoslavia with Italy, force succeeded, and in Corfu, the Corfu incident, we've done that with Mussolini, force succeeded. And then France and the Ruhr in 1923, you've done that presumably when looking at Hitler. Germans stopped paying reparation payments to France. France occupied the Ruhr industrial area. The Ruhr workers struck. The French imprisoned the striking workers. The French didn't gain very much, but the reparation payments from Germany to France became steadier because the American Dawes Plan, which was loans and rescheduling the payments of the reparations from Germany to France, came in force in 1924. So once again, force succeeded. And then there were a lot of smaller crises as well. Memel, which was seized by Lithuania, the China incident, which is the full-scale war of Japan against China. All these things, the League of Nations was unable to stop or to mollify really in any way. So we have to ask ourselves as Christians, why? And it's something when working through all this that I thought about a lot. And I've come to the following conclusions. See if you agree with me. War is a consequence of sin, ultimately, isn't it? It's a consequence of human greed, human lust for power, and human cruelty. This wasn't something that was recognised by the League of Nations, and therefore it failed to keep the peace. War is not usually a consequence of nations having disputes to settle which could be settled by peaceful means. That was Woodrow Wilson's idea. His idea was to get nations together to peacefully settle their differences. But if you look at the things we've talked about, the aggression of Mussolini in Ethiopia, for instance, talking about that between Ethiopia and Mussolini, it just isn't a way forward, because it doesn't recognise that one nation is wrongly practising aggression against another. The realities of life are that there are aggressors who will not listen to reason. Powerful evil nations will prey on weaker ones, and they have to be faced with force and stopped from pursuing their evil ways by force or the threat of force. Now, the problem of trying to put that force into the hands of an international body, if you said, all right then, what's needed is a League of Nations which has power, has real things it can do, has an army, if you like, that can go in and force Mussolini to stop invading Abyssinia. The problem of that is one of control. Who is to say what is right and who is the evil aggressor? In the nature of things, the aggressor himself and his supporters are members of the League of Nations. And the only way individual nations can protect themselves is different from this, in my view. If you give the international body control, you still have to have someone saying who is in the right, who's wrong, how is that done? How can you do it effectively? The League of Nations failed to do it. They couldn't, with their one nation, one vote principle, they couldn't sort out the rights and wrongs of things. They could, at best, try and balance bad against good and go in the middle way. Again, Ethiopia is a good example. To give 2/3 of Ethiopia to the aggressor, it's not morally right. It's only halfway between the two sides, the demands of the two sides. And the fact is that one side is demanding a share of another country. So if you go halfway between those two demands, you get something in the middle, but it's not morally right. And everybody can see that, I think. The only way individual nations can protect themselves is a scriptural one, which is righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. You both know that text, I'm sure. Godly nations have throughout history been protected internationally. You only got to think of England under Cromwell or Victoria, the Netherlands fighting against Philip II, Gustav Adolphus of Sweden, and so on. If you look at history as a whole now, you look at nations who have tried, however imperfectly, to However, not perfect, because human beings aren't perfect, but nations who have genuinely tried to live in a godly and righteous way have always been protected. If you look at history, it really is the case. And then I think that the League of Nations was an attempt to bring peace by purely human means without dependence on God, and that's why it was a failure. Now, I'm not saying that would get you any marks in an exam, James, but there's no reason why you shouldn't put it if you want to. They can't take marks away from you for what you believe. But I think it's interesting that as a Christian you get an answer to that question, you get a way of looking at it which is satisfactory. If you look at textbooks, they're at a loss to know, really. They can see the problem that the League of Nations didn't work, and even if it has been given teeth, and we'll see that when we look at the United Nations, it couldn't work. The fact is that as Christians we can see why, and also what the solution is nationally to nations who do want peace and prosperity and protection from aggressors. Okay, any questions?
No.
No? No, that's easy, because often I don't know the answer, like what happens to the King of Italy?